everyone. Welcome back to the Deep Research Podcast.
Great to be here.
Today, we're doing a real deep dive into something that's, well, dominating the news, but is also incredibly complex. The escalating conflict between Israel and Iran.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to try and move beyond just the surface level stuff, the breaking news alerts.
Right, because there are layers here. Deep strategic calculations, motivations that aren't immediately obvious, and potential consequences that could ripple out globally.
Exactly. So our mission today is to really unpack all of that. We want to give you a kind of shortcut to getting properly informed, maybe connect some dots, and hopefully provide a few of those aha moments.
And we've got some great analysis to draw on insights from places like the Summer YouTube channel, some really sharp articles from Foreign Policy by Daniel Byman and Howard French, reporting from the New York Times. It gives us a solid base to work from.
Absolutely. We're aiming for clarity on a topic that can feel, frankly, pretty overwhelming.
Yeah, it's definitely nuanced. And the sources we're looking at, they really pull back the curtain on some fascinating, sometimes pretty alarming strategic thinking.
We're talking history, politics, military moves.
All tangled together. It's
Yeah.
not just one event after another. It's about understanding the underlying fears, the long-term goals, maybe even some critical missteps driving things forward.
So yeah, critical thinking is key here. Trying to separate the noise from the actual signals on the ground.
Okay, let's get into it.
So peeling back that first layer, maybe the most surprising thing right off the bat, something highlighted in the summary channel's analysis, is the initial reaction to Israel's strikes.
Right. You'd think military action from a power like Israel instills, I don't know, fear, respect, awe, maybe.
Yeah, you'd expect that. But what happened instead? Laughter. Seriously, ridicule.
It's wild, isn't it? The reports show that across Arab media, social media especially, the reaction wasn't terror. It was humor, sarcasm.
They called it a comedy play. Memes everywhere, sarcastic comments, emojis. It just flooded the online space.
And this points to something huge in modern conflict, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The information war, the battle for perception.
Totally. Israel, it seems, was genuinely surprised by this. They're used to their military actions having a certain weight, certain gravity.
And instead, they're the ones being mocked.
Wow.
Usually it's the side that gets hit, the perceived loser, that faces the ridicule. But here, the attacker was the butt of the joke.
It kind of flips the script.
It really does. It shows how a powerful narrative, even one built on memes and jokes, can actually land a bigger psychological punch than the physical strike itself. It completely undermines the attacker's intended effect.
So the battlefield isn't just physical anymore, it's narrative, it's psychological.
Absolutely. That's a key takeaway right there, the power of perception.
And Iran didn't just sit back and laugh, right? They hit back with some very specific, very symbolic counterstrikes. Can you walk us through those?
Yeah, they did. And the targets were chosen carefully. Take the strike on Israeli Channel 14's headquarters. The summary analysis really emphasizes this. On the surface, okay, a news channel got hit. But Channel 14, it's widely known in Israel, described as Netanyahu's channel.
Ah, so it's politically significant.
Hugely significant. It's seen as fiercely loyal to him, broadcasting his narrative. Striking it as like symbolically hitting Netanyahu directly in his own house.
Wow.
It wasn't random. It was a deliberate message. You hit our media, we hit yours, and we'll hit the one closest to your seat of power. It's retaliation, but it's also psychological warfare aimed right at the top.
A precision strike, but symbolic rather than just physical. That adds another layer.
Definitely. And then there's the other claim, the really audacious one. Iran saying they hit a military base under a hospital in Beersheba.
Okay, that sounds controversial. Israel denied it, right? Said it was civilian targets.
Of course, Israel denied it, claimed only civilian areas were struck. But the significance here, according to the Iranian media analysis cited by Summary, is the narrative Iran is pushing.
What's the narrative?
They're basically saying, look, Israel is doing exactly what it accuses Hamas of doing, using civilian sites like hospitals to shield military assets.
Ah, turning the accusation back on them.
Exactly. Now, verifying this in wartime, almost impossible. As Summary notes, you'll likely never get confirmation from Israel if such a base existed. But that's almost beside the point.
Why?
Because it's about shaping perception. It plants doubt. It challenges Israel's narrative of taking the moral high ground. It could even chip away at international support over time. It's pure information warfare.
So truth becomes secondary to narrative control.
Right.
Weaponizing accusations.
Precisely. And this immediate back and forth, this battle for perception, it set the tone. It showed this wasn't going to be the quick, clean conflict maybe Israel initially expected.
Yeah, our sources suggest Israel thought this might be over quickly. Days, maybe weeks.
That seems to have been the initial calculation, yes.
Yeah.
But Iran's response, their ability to sustain these targeted symbolic strikes, their refusal to just roll over, it's turned into what one source called a catastrophe for Israel's planning, meaning it's dragging on, it's costing resources, disrupting life, preventing that quick return to normal that they likely hoped for. It's not the swift victory they envisioned.
And you mentioned the U.S. president's estimate.
Right. The U.S. president, cited by summary, was talking about at least 2 more weeks of conflict at that point. And you combine that with the massive, ongoing U.S. military buildup we're seeing.
Which we'll definitely get into later.
It all points towards a long haul, not a quick operation, which really begs the question, doesn't it? Why did expectations shift so dramatically? What's really driving this prolonged, complex fight?
Okay, so that leads us perfectly into the big question. We've got this unexpected start, the info war. But why did it start right now? Daniel Byman over at Foreign Policy really tackled this.
Yeah, it's the crucial question.
Because the immediate thought, the one probably most people had, was Iran's getting close to a nuclear weapon. Israel had to act. End of story.
That's the common narrative, absolutely. But Byman's analysis, and other intel sources too, they really pour cold water on that idea.
How so?
Well, look at U.S. intelligence assessments. Back in March, the Director of National Intelligence at the time, Tulsi Gabbard, was on record saying Iran was not actively pursuing nuclear weapons. No unusual activity detected.
Okay.
And even Trump, interestingly, after Israel's strike, he publicly questioned it. He basically asked, if U.S. intel saw nothing new, why strike now? That discrepancy is pretty telling.
So the imminent bomb threat narrative, it doesn't quite hold up under scrutiny.
It seems not.
Yeah.
The timing wasn't driven by some sudden dash for the bomb by Iran.
Okay, so if that wasn't the trigger, what was? This is where it gets really interesting based on the foreign policy analysis.
Exactly. The main driver, the real reason for the timing, according to this analysis, is something much deeper, much more covert. The army inside Iran theory.
An army inside Iran, what does that mean?
It means Mossad, Israel's intelligence agency, had spent potentially decades building a massive internal intelligence network inside Iran. We're not talking just a few spies. We're talking a large-scale operation. Hundreds, maybe thousands of assets. They were doing things like smuggling in drone parts, setting up secret workshops inside Iran to make spare parts, even assembling entire drones.
For what purpose?
For targeted operations, hitting specific air defense systems, assassinating key figures, right there on Iranian soil.
Like the nuclear scientists.
Precisely. The sources report that this internal network was responsible for eliminating 9 out of Iran's top 10 nuclear scientists, often killed right in their homes, and the 10th one, also taken out, reportedly with some kind of undisclosed weapon.
Chilling. That suggests incredible penetration.
Absolutely. This internal network was arguably far more effective, far more precise than launching airstrikes from outside.
So why act now? Why risk exposing it in a sense?
Because, according to the theory, the asset grew too big. Too successful, maybe, and therefore too risky. The bigger it got, the harder it was to keep secret, the higher the chance of discovery.
Ah, the risk of compromise became too high.
Exactly. It reached a point where the risk of the whole thing unraveling forced Israel's hand. They had to make a decisive move before it was potentially exposed.
Is there a precedent for this?
Yes. The sources draw a parallel to an earlier Israeli operation against Hezbollah, codenamed Beaver. That operation was apparently triggered when Hezbollah started uncovering the plot, forcing Israel to act prematurely.
And is there evidence this Iranian network was at risk?
Well, there are suggestive reports. Iranian police recently announced arresting alleged Mossad agents in Tehran. They claim to have found a significant amount of explosives, like 200 kilograms, plus drone kits, launch platforms, control vehicles. It points to a substantial operation being disrupted.
Okay.
And there's another angle, Ukraine. Ukraine's success using similar internal sabotage and drone attacks deep inside Russia might have been a wake-up call for Iran, made them more vigilant about internal threats, potentially increasing the pressure on Israel's timeline.
That makes sense, a sort of indirect catalyst. So this huge, potentially compromised intelligence asset seems like a primary driver for the timing. What else was feeding into this moment?
Several other factors seem to have converged. One was Israel's perception that Iran's regional influence was weakening.
Meaning their proxies. Hezbollah, Assad, the Houthis.
Exactly. Hezbollah in Lebanon, Assad in Syria, the Houthis in Yemen, various militias in Iraq. Israel seemingly assessed that these groups were weakened, maybe tied down by other conflicts, or had suffered defeats.
So they saw an opportunity.
It looks like it. They perhaps calculated that Iran's arms were less capable of a strong retaliatory response, making it a good time to strike Iran the head of the snake, as some might see it directly, believing the regional pushback would be manageable.
A window of opportunity based on perceived weakness. Okay. What else?
A major factor, definitely, was concern over potential U.S.-Iran rapprochement.
Like another nuclear deal.
Precisely. Israel was deeply worried about the U.S. and Iran getting close to a deal similar to the Obama-era JCPOA, which Israel consistently labels a disaster and existential threat.
Was a deal actually close?
The sources suggest it was closer than many realized. Apparently, they were nearing an agreement on uranium enrichment levels, maybe just haggling over the final wording.
And Israel couldn't let that happen.
From Israel's perspective, Iran's nuclear program is non-negotiable. They likely felt they couldn't risk a diplomatic outcome that might legitimize any part of Iran's program or tie Israel's hands later. They felt the need to act preemptively against that possibility.
A race against diplomacy, in a way.
You could see it like that. And connected to this is a fourth point: Israel's perceived impunity regarding the U.S.
Meaning they felt they could act without serious consequences from Washington.
Yeah, the sense seems to have been that the U.S. administration at the time wouldn't significantly punish Israel, even for aggressive actions against Iran. This belief in unwavering American backing, or at least tolerance, likely gave them the confidence to make a bolder move, a sort of green light, maybe implicit.
Okay, so intelligence risks, regional opportunity, fear of diplomacy, perceived U.S. backing. Anything else? What about domestic politics?
Oh, absolutely. Domestic political motivations are almost always part of the mix in these situations, aren't they? And on both sides, potentially?
For Trump, for instance.
Well, sources point out he was facing a lot of heat internally: conflicts, protests, team disputes, even friction with Netanyahu himself. A foreign crisis, historically, can be a very effective way to divert attention and rally support, the rally around the flag effect.
And for Netanyahu.
Similar dynamics. He was dealing with huge internal political divisions. Remember the judicial reform protests, religious parties threatening to bolt the coalition. A war, particularly against a major adversary like Iran, can serve to unite a fractured country, consolidate power, and silence domestic critics.
It's a cynical calculus, but a common one in politics. War as a unifier or a distraction.
It often plays a role. And then you have the deeper, longer-term ideological currents.
You mean the Israeli far-right's agenda?
Yes. This is crucial and often downplayed. There's a significant, powerful element within the Israeli far-right, very influential in the government, that harbors ambitions for a greater Israel.
Expanding territory.
Expanding into parts of Syria, Lebanon, realizing a much larger territorial vision. And from that perspective, Iran is seen as the biggest obstacle. Not just its nuclear program, but the regime itself, its regional influence. It all stands in the way of those expansionist goals.
So weakening or even changing the regime in Iran becomes a prerequisite for their larger vision.
That appears to be part of the thinking. For some factions, yes. It's not just about defense. It's about enabling future ambitions.
And finally, you mentioned a religious dimension.
Yes, we can't ignore the religious war framing. The Israeli operation itself was reportedly named Soaring Lion.
Like the Narnia reference?
Well, yes. But the sources note it's also a phrase rooted in the Torah, symbolizing a powerful, almost divinely sanctioned force that destroys its enemies. Naming it that deliberately imbues the conflict with a religious, even messianic significance for some in Israel.
And on the Iranian side?
They frame it in equally existential terms: a final confrontation, a defense against an aggressor threatening their very existence, often using religious rhetoric as well.
So it's not just geopolitics, it's deeply ideological, even spiritual for some involved.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And when you put it all together, the exposed intelligence network, the shifting regional power balance, the race against diplomacy, the perceived U.S. backing, the domestic political needs, the far-right ambitions, the religious framing, it paints a much more complex picture of why now. It wasn't just one thing. It was a confluence of factors creating this incredibly volatile moment.
It's clear this isn't just contained between Israel and Iran. And based on everything we've just discussed, the U.S. role becomes critical. All the signs, according to our sources, point to the U.S. not just watching, but actively gearing up for direct involvement. The question in U.S. media, as the Summary Channel highlighted, shifted from if the U.S. would get involved to when. That's a significant change in tone.
That's a huge shift. And the evidence on the ground is hard to ignore. The scale of the U.S. military buildup in the region is staggering. It really signals more than just deterrence.
What kind of assets are we talking about?
We're talking major hardware.
Uh,
A second aircraft carrier strike group, led by the USS Nimitz, moved into the area. That's immense naval power. Then there are the B-2 Spirit bombers. These aren't just any planes. They're nuclear-capable stealth bombers, designed to penetrate heavy air defenses undetected. Hugely expensive, about $2 billion each.
$2 billion.
Yep. And 2 were sent directly to Israel, on top of 6 others already positioned near Iran. You don't deploy assets like that at that cost, just for show or routine maneuvers. It signals serious intent for a potential major strike.
And other aircraft, too.
Lots of other advanced fighters, support aircraft, naval vessels. It's a massive logistical effort. As summary stress, this isn't just drills. This costs serious money, pulls assets from other regions. It's preparation for war.
And wasn't there something about withdrawing citizens before the strikes?
Yes, that's another key indicator.
Yeah.
The U.S. started withdrawing non-essential personnel and citizens from places like Iraq and some Gulf states, and reducing diplomatic staff before the initial Israeli strikes happened.
So they knew it was coming.
It strongly implies foreknowledge and planning. They weren't just reacting, they were proactively preparing for the potential fallout of military action. That speaks volumes about the level of coordination or anticipation.
And it's not just the U.S. acting alone, is it? Allies are involved, too.
Right. The UK's involvement is notable. The British Foreign Secretary met with the U.S. Secretary of State, a meeting described as fruitful, and shortly after, UK military units were deployed to Israel.
Signaling a coalition.
It certainly looks like a coordinated effort, a consolidating alliance among key Western powers preparing for, well, something significant, a unified front.
This is raising the stakes considerably. Are other global powers reacting?
They are, and in ways that are pretty concerning. Take the Russian warnings.
What did they warn about?
Russia specifically warned the U.S. against using tactical nuclear weapons, particularly targeting Iran's Fordow nuclear facility, which is buried deep underground. They call such a move potentially catastrophic.
Is that just rhetoric, or is there context?
There's context. It mirrors warnings NATO gave Russia regarding potential nuclear use in Ukraine. It feels like a direct tit-for-tat signal. If you cross this line in Iran, it could have repercussions elsewhere. It escalates the situation beyond the Middle East, potentially drawing in major global powers.
Wow. A nuclear dimension being openly discussed. That's incredibly serious. So, with all this hardware moving into place, what do the sources suggest is the actual U.S. objective if they intervene directly?
Based on the analysis, particularly citing the New York Times via summary, the U.S. intentions seem focused on a decisive military outcome, not prolonged diplomacy at this stage.
Meaning?
Trump's talk of buying time those 2 weeks wasn't seen as time for talks, but time to get all the military pieces perfectly positioned.
For what specific goal?
The primary objective appears to be a devastating strike on the Fordow facility. The aim described is to deliver a hell of an aerial bombardment to destroy Iran's most hardened nuclear site and significantly degrade its capabilities.
So not negotiation, but a knockout blow.
That seems to be the strategic calculus suggested by the buildup in the reporting. It points towards the U.S. viewing this as requiring a full-scale military commitment to achieve a specific, decisive result, rather than a limited intervention or just providing support. All the moves suggest preparation for a major offensive operation.
Okay, so we've talked about high-tech bombers, potential nuclear facilities. But, our sources point to something else. Iran's potentially most powerful weapon might be a much lower tech, but incredibly disruptive.
You're talking about the Strait of Hormuz.
Exactly, mining the strait. It sounds almost old-fashioned, but the impact could be enormous.
It's a classic example of asymmetric warfare, leveraging geography. And the strategic importance of Hormuz is just immense. You really can't overstate it.
Remind us of the numbers.
It's a narrow channel, maybe 90 kilometers long at its tightest point. But through that bottleneck flows roughly 25% of the world's daily oil exports and about 20% of its liquefied natural gas, LNG.
A quarter of the world's oil.
Yep. If that strait closes, even temporarily, the global economy basically seizes up. Energy prices, especially in Europe, which is heavily reliant, would skyrocket instantly. Supply chains break down worldwide. You're looking at a potential global recession triggered overnight.
Economic catastrophe.
Absolutely. Forget missiles for a second. This is potentially global economic paralysis, and it's something Iran has specifically prepared for.
How so? Their navy isn't considered top tier, is it?
Compared to the U.S. Navy?
Yeah.
No. But Iranian naval specialization since the Khomeini era has heavily focused on this exact scenario. mining Hormuz. It's a core part of their defensive asymmetric strategy.
Sure, good at it.
They've trained for it extensively. For Iran, laying mines in the strait is considered relatively easy. They have the mines, the small boats, the know-how. They could probably do it in weeks, maybe even days.
But clearing them?
That's the hard part. For the U.S. and allies, clearing a mine strait like Hormuz is incredibly dangerous, slow, and difficult. We're talking potentially months of painstaking work, even with the best technology. It's a cheap deterrent for Iran, with a very high cost for anyone trying to counter it.
So it really tilts the scales in that specific scenario. What kind of mines are we actually talking about? Are they all the same?
No, there's a range, and each poses different challenges. Our sources detail 3 main types of mines Iran might use.
Okay.
First, you have adhesive mines, or limpet mines. These are attached directly to a ship's hull, often by divers or small subs, usually below the waterline. They have a timer and detonate later. Simple but effective.
Right.
Second, these are the really tricky ones, are deep-sea mines. Modern, sophisticated, they sit on the seabed, making them very hard to detect with sonar. They have sensors, acoustic, magnetic, maybe pressure, or even fine hairs that detect a ship passing overhead. Once triggered, the mine detaches from its anchor on the seabed, rises up, and strikes the ship from below, often targeting the keel, the most vulnerable part. Very hard to defend against.
Wow. Silent killers.
Pretty much. And third, there are the shallow depth mines. These are simpler, often tethered just below the surface. They might be visible from the air if you know what to look for, but ships often can't see them until it's too late. They disrupt shipping lanes, create navigational hazards.
So a mix of technologies designed to make passage incredibly dangerous.
Exactly. And Iran's Navy, particularly the Revolutionary Guard's naval forces, has practiced deploying all these types in the specific conditions of the strait.
Has this threat ever materialized before? Is there a history here?
Oh yes, there's a very relevant historical precedent. During the later stages of the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, Iran did mine parts of the strait.
What happened?
It led directly to a major incident in 1988. The U.S. frigate, USS Samuel B. Roberts, hit an Iranian mine while escorting Kuwaiti oil tankers. It didn't sink, but it was severely damaged, almost broken too.
And the U.S. response?
Swift and brutal. It triggered Operation Praying Mantis. The U.S. Navy and Air Force launched a major retaliatory strike, sinking or damaging several Iranian naval vessels and destroying key Iranian oil platforms being used as military posts.
So a clear message was sent.
A very clear message. The U.S. will use overwhelming force to keep the strait open. So while mining is a powerful threat for Iran, it also carries the risk of massive retaliation based on historical precedent.
What would be the immediate consequences if Iran did mine the strait now?
Multi-layered chaos. First, obviously, oil and gas shipments stop dead, global economic shockwaves, as we discussed.
Right.
Second, it would effectively trap any U.S. naval forces currently inside the Persian Gulf. The Nimitz carrier group, other ships, they'd be bottled up in a potentially hostile environment, their freedom of maneuver severely restricted.
That's a huge tactical implication.
Massive. Third, there's the idea of reputational closure.
Yeah.
Even if Iran only lays a few mines or just credibly threatens to mine it, the global shipping insurance market would likely react immediately. Premiums would skyrocket, or insurers would refuse cover altogether for voyages through Hormuz. Shipping companies wouldn't risk it. So the strait effectively closes to commercial traffic, even without being fully mined, simply due to the perceived risk. The threat becomes the reality.
Wow. The threat itself is the weapon.
In large part, yes. And fourth, this would almost certainly force the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, whose entire economies depend on exporting through Hormuz, to potentially join the conflict against Iran. Their vital interests would be directly threatened.
And the U.S. knows this, presumably. They're moving assets out of some Gulf states.
Yes, reports of the U.S. moving some assets from places like Qatar and Bahrain could be seen as preemptive moves, recognizing that those bases could become vulnerable if the Gulf states get drawn in or if Iran targets them directly in response to the Hormuz situation.
Okay, it's a high-stakes game of chicken. What U.S. countermeasures exist? How can they deal with this mine threat?
They have capabilities, but it's tough.
Yeah.
They maintain 4 dedicated mine countermeasures,
Yes.
minesweepers, in the region. These are specialized vessels designed for this job.
Okay.
Then there's a very specialized unit, Division 56. It's a small group, maybe 100 personnel, of elite U.S. Navy divers based nearby in Oman. Their specific mission is explosive ordnance disposal, including sophisticated sea mines, often in covert or hostile conditions. They're the tip of the spear for dealing with mines physically.
Highly specialized.
Very. And for detection, they rely on assets like the P-8A Poseidon aircraft, especially the newer Block 2 version, which had a major upgrade costing something like $245 million, specifically enhancing its ability to detect submerged objects like mines, as well as surface vessels like Iranian fast attack craft from a distance.
So they have tools, but it's still a massive challenge.
It absolutely is, and it's fascinating, isn't it? This specific threat, the relatively low-tech mining of Hormuz, is reportedly a major factor delaying any immediate U.S. decision on direct military action. They need all their countermine assets, like the Nimitz with its helicopter mine countermeasures squadrons, fully in place and ready before potentially triggering a response that could involve mining.
It shows how asymmetric threats can really complicate the plans of even the most powerful military forces them to pause and prepare.
Exactly. Even overwhelming air power has to account for the humble sea mine in a critical choke point.
So, for everyone listening, we've covered the initial sparks, the deep strategic drivers, the U.S. buildup, and this critical Hormuz dimension. But now we need to zoom out. What about the long game? What happens after any potential military action?
Right.
Howard French, another really sharp analyst at foreign policy, raises some incredibly important and frankly quite troubling questions about the U.S. track record when it comes to military interventions in the Middle East. It's a history we maybe don't reflect on enough.
French's perspective is vital here. He urges us to draw clear lessons from past U.S. interventions, and the picture isn't pretty. He argues compellingly that these actions, whatever their initial intentions of us, democracy, stability, counterterrorism, often ended up making things significantly worse.
Like where? Give us the examples he uses.
Okay, take Iraq. The 2003 invasion. The stated goal was regime change, WMDs, democracy. What was the actual result? A country fractured along sectarian lines, the rise of an autonomous Kurdistan, a proliferation of powerful militias often backed by Iran itself, massive Iranian influence across the country, and a nation that was once oil-rich, left largely destitute and unstable.
Definitely not the intended outcome.
Not even close. Then look at Afghanistan. 20 years of occupation, trillions spent, thousands of lives lost. It ended with what French calls a scandalous withdrawal, the Taliban immediately retaking power, and intelligence assessments suggesting al-Qaeda is now potentially more ferocious and regrouped there.
Another sobering example.
And Libya. Intervention after Gaddafi, ostensibly to prevent a humanitarian disaster. The result? A country split in two, east versus west, with chaotic militias controlling parts of the south, ongoing civil strife, despite Libya also being rich in oil. Stable democracy. Not exactly.
So French's point is?
His point is simple but profound. The U.S. has to look honestly at this pattern of failure, these unintended consequences, this consistent underestimation of the complexities involved, before even considering intervention in a place as large, complex, and strategically pivotal as Iran. History suggests caution is paramount.
It's a powerful argument for humility, really, looking at the actual results, not just the promises. Now, linking this to Iran specifically, Israel's strategy, as we discussed, involved targeting key figures like those nuclear scientists. How effective has that been in destabilizing the Iranian regime itself?
That's a key part of French's analysis, too, touching on the paradox of targeting Iranian leadership. Despite Israel's documented success in eliminating 9, maybe all 10, top nuclear scientists, a significant blow, you'd think the Iranian regime shows, quote, no indications of collapsing.
It hasn't fundamentally weakened them.
Not in terms of overall regime stability, it seems. Even when protests erupt in Iran, which they do periodically over economic or social issues, our sources describe them as generally lacking the scale or organization to pose a genuine existential threat to the ruling system. The regime appears remarkably resilient, perhaps due to its security apparatus, institutional depth, or support from key segments of the population.
Which leads to that difficult question, the known versus unknown regime dilemma.
Right. Exactly. It's a classic problem in foreign policy. Remember, even Donald Trump reportedly argued against assassinating Iran's supreme leader, Khamenei, using that old logic. The devil you know is better than the devil you don't.
Better to deal with the current regime, however difficult, than risk what comes next.
That's the idea. And Howard French, interestingly, echoes this, but with a darker twist. He argues that if the current Iranian regime does fall apart, whether from external pressure or internal collapse, we shouldn't automatically assume what replaces it will be better or more aligned with Western interests.
What does he predict might happen instead?
He warns it could lead to a weak, opposition, militarily extremist system. Imagine a scenario where the current theocracy collapses, and who steps into the power vacuum? Likely hardline military figures, maybe from the Revolutionary Guard,
And what would their priority be?
to consolidate power and gain legitimacy. And how might they do that? By projecting strength, by appealing to nationalism. French suggest they would likely be even more extreme in their rhetoric and actions against Israel, against the U.S., against Arab rivals than the current regime. They'd need to prove their anti-imperialist revolutionary credentials.
So regime change doesn't automatically mean moderation. It could mean something worse.
That's the potential danger French highlights. It completely challenges the often-held illusion of a short, decisive war leading to a positive outcome.
The idea that a quick military strike could just remove the problem.
Right. While the U.S. might aim for a swift blow to cripple the nuclear program and maybe shake the regime, French asserts this is dangerously simplistic. Based on history and the nature of Iran, the likely consequence isn't that Iran will be better off,
But
rather it could descend into even deeper chaos, potentially paving the way for a military-led government that's more radical, more unpredictable, and possibly even more dangerous to regional stability in the long run.
It really forces you to think beyond the immediate military objectives.
Absolutely. It raises that fundamental question. Is achieving a short-term military goal, like degrading a nuclear program, worth risking long-term regional chaos and potentially empowering an even more hostile successor regime? French's analysis, drawing on decades of history, urges extreme caution and a serious reevaluation of those assumptions. #outros.
Okay, so as we start to wrap this up, wow, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. An incredibly complex, volatile, and frankly, still escalating situation. We've seen how the timing wasn't just about Iran's nuclear program nearing some finish line. It was much more about, well, exposed intelligence operations built up over decades, shifting power dynamics across the Middle East, maybe weakened proxies.
And also those domestic political pressures, right, both in Israel and potentially in the U.S., making a foreign conflict seem maybe convenient or even necessary for leaders facing trouble at home.
Right. And we explored how Iran's most potent response might not even be a missile attack, but those sea mines in the Strait of Hormuz, a low-tech threat with potentially catastrophic global economic consequences capable of trapping powerful navies.
A real asymmetric equalizer.
Definitely. And then, critically, we looked at the potential aftermath, how U.S. intervention, even if intended to be short and sharp, carries this heavy historical baggage and could, counterintuitively, lead to even greater chaos, maybe even a more radical, unpredictable regime in Iran. Not necessarily a more peaceful outcome at all.
It really is a sobering perspective when you look at the long-term view.
It is, isn't it?
And on that note, maybe here's something to really chew on. In a region like the Middle East, where history seems to have this relentless habit of repeating itself, sometimes tragically, how much of what we're seeing now is genuinely new? And how much is just, well, a rerun of past strategic miscalculations, past interventions gone wrong, just maybe with different actors, higher technological stakes, but fundamentally similar flawed assumptions driving it all? Are the real lessons ever truly learned?
That's a powerful thought to leave people with. Are we learning or just repeating? We hope this deep dive has given all of you listening some fresh perspective, maybe raised some new questions you hadn't considered.
Keep digging, keep questioning.
Absolutely. Stay curious, keep those questions coming, and always try to look for the layers beneath the headlines.
And please, if you found this valuable, subscribe to the Deep Research Podcast for more insights like this.
Until next time, keep exploring.
Keep learning.